The Retirement Cafe podcast. What's so fascinating about getting old? Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Retirement Cafe podcast with me, your host, Justin King. If you're thinking about your retirement or already retired, you're in the right place. My aim is to help you plan for and live a successful and meaningful retirement. Retirement is far more than just a financial event. It's a significant life event, a major transition, which will bring with it new challenges and opportunities. So each episode contains tips, information, and inspiration to help you feel more informed and confident about your retirement. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Welcome to the Retirement Cafe podcast. Today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Martin Hyde, a renowned gerontologist. In our conversation, we delve into what being a gerontologist actually means, and Martin debunks the misconception that studying older individuals is uninteresting or uninspiring. Martin has collaborated with researchers from around the globe, allowing him to explore the diverse experiences of aging in different countries and among various groups of people. His work has truly become an exciting area of research, keeping him continually curious and eager to learn more about the complexities of aging. So, dear listeners, prepare for an engaging and enlightening conversation as we dive into the world of gerontology and gain valuable insights into the ever-evolving landscape of aging, work and retirement. So, welcome to the Retirement Cafe podcast, Martin Hyde.
Thank you very much for having me, Justin. Very excited to be here, have a chance to chat to you and your listeners about some of the work we've been doing and some of the work more generally in the sort of field of aging and work and retirement. So thank you very much for inviting me to be involved.
Well, Martin, you're a gerontologist. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. I've been practicing all morning. For those who don't know what a gerontologist does and didn't see it on the career path when they were at school, maybe you could explain what you do and how you've become a gerontologist.
I can try. Very simply, gerontology is the study of aging. But within that, it sort of encompasses a whole range of different areas, aspects, research directions. So we have people looking at huge, what we might call kind of societal level challenges around aging, the impact of the built environment, impact of globalization, and more recently climate change, all the way down to people looking at what happens inside the body in terms of how different aspects of your internal organs or cognitive processes work. So it's a huge and very exciting area in which to work because almost everything we can think about is impacted on either by our own personal experience of aging, so how we've got to where we are today, the things we've gone through. You can think about all the influences you've had on your life, but also how you're thinking about where you'd like to get to as we age and the challenges that we might face when we do that, but also the impact of how populations themselves are aging and the challenges and the opportunities that presents for a wide range of institutions, organizations, other sections of society. So it's a really dynamic area. And I think that's one of the big challenges about working in gerontology. A, because it's almost unpronounceable. B, because once you tell people, I study older people, they immediately sort of switch off and they think, well, that's not very exciting. That's not very sexy. And actually it is. It's really dynamic and it's really interesting. And those of us, I suppose, who are lucky enough to get into later life recognize that you've had all this wonderful experience, this tapestry of different ways of living, what you've seen and what you've worked through, but also how you sort of want to live your life and how we're going to kind of adapt to the changing world around us as we ourselves are changing. I will say, in terms of how I got here, and this seems to be almost the sort of the most common route into gerontology, is purely by accident. It isn't something that is very, in this country, in the UK rather, it's quite interesting because it isn't something that's taught at undergraduate level. You might get the odd lecture here and there on aging. There are some postgraduate courses, but it's something that sort of people tend to come into through other routes. So I came into it, I see my first job was designing a survey to measure quality of life in later life, which I wrote 20 years ago.
Wow.
And I've been very fortunate that that little measure that we developed has gone on to be used in about 30 different countries around the world. I just got an email from somebody who's trying to translate it into Hungarian this week. So that sort of opened my eyes to what was going on in later life in this sort of really dynamic process. But I suppose, as with most things that are interesting, once you're in, you kind of want to stay in and learn out learn about what's going on and how aging is different for different groups of people and how aging is different in different parts of the world. So I've been lucky enough to work with people around the world and look at how aging is different in different countries. So yeah, very exciting area of research.
So, have we got some unique challenges in the UK that you don't see in the rest of the world?
I think the big challenge in the UK, I think there's a number of challenges in the UK at the moment. I think one of them is that we're sort of somewhere in terms of retirement, which I suppose most people kind of identify as being the big threshold in which you can kind of say you enter this sort of period of older age or later life. We are somewhere between, let's say, the European countries, which most of them still have a fixed retirement age, in America, where they sort of got rid of their fixed retirement age back in, I think, the 1970s. So in the UK, we got rid of our fixed retirement age in 2011, which seems like a long time ago. It's over a decade ago now. But in the terms of someone's career trajectory, we think about that cohort who are now approaching what would have been their state retirement age, and even their state pension age. They planned for that. Now that's become a sort of a movable feast. So there's a challenge about how people are planning for this big change in their career life trajectory or their career biography, where they were anticipating a certain transition, and now that's very different. So some of it can be quite prosaic. For example, that you now no longer retire, but you have to quit work. So just people learning that they have to do that rather than you get the letter and the carriage clock that says, thank you very much, here you go. But psychologically, that can be quite different. I mean, most people don't like to be thought of as quitters. Most people like to be thought of as, I'm going to do my job and carry on doing that. So the psychological change to do that is I think, something that we probably haven't anticipated as much as we ought to have done. And then I think from the other side, the sort of the employer's side, I know a number of employers find it quite difficult now to talk to older workers around their retirement plans because they feel that they might be seen to be ageist in raising this as an issue and kind of almost sort of saying, well, you should be thinking about this. So we have a cohort of people who are approaching retirement who I think are probably less prepared for it than previous cohorts because this is changing. There's uncertainty or variability in the pension age. That's been rising, and obviously men and women's pension age has been moving to catch up with one another. And that's caused, a whole range of challenges there for a certain cohort of older women. But then there's still uncertainty about when's that going to stop. So I'm in my late 40s. I don't know when my state pension age is likely to be. And it's probably going to kind of get tied to life expectancy at some point. And therefore, how you plan for that much more contingent, uncertain transition, I think is something that we need to sort of begin to build into our career pathways and discussions much earlier in life. I think the other thing, which isn't unique to the UK, though, is cost of living crisis. I think that seems to have impacted people in the UK in different ways than in other parts of particularly Europe. So we saw the Great Retirement, lots of people leaving work during the COVID pandemic, and now the Great Unretirement as people are sort of moving back in to the labour market. The problem is, it's often quite challenging for older adults to re-enter the labour market once they've left work. So I do think over the next 5 years, we're probably going to see some real challenges about how that sort of, 50 to 65-year-old age group, or particularly the 55 to 64-year-old age group, kind of managing in the workplace. I think there's going to be some issues there and how they translate into later life as well. So maybe even over the next 10 to 15 years, we might see some of what we call the scarring effects of those challenges.
Right. Yeah. And, you talk about, going back into work, whether you need to go back into work. Obviously, your expected income may suddenly now not be enough because, of course,
Hmm.
this cost of living crisis, as you mentioned. And then, of course, I'm always very present about the what I call the equity someone's got in their career, i.e., the currency. 12 months out of a job, you're still probably fairly current. You could probably slot back in. But actually, 36 months out of your career, things are moving very fast. And, maybe there could be, I'm sure, some aspects of work that don't move quite as
Yeah.
quickly. But often enough, even just procedures and software and things, the tools that you would have just got used to over a period of time, 36 months later, are significantly different.
Yeah, I think probably more and more so. I mean, I know there's probably quite a lot of big claims made about AI and the impact that's going to have on our jobs. But even in academia, which has always been seen as a fairly high-skilled job that's somewhat kind of resistant to big changes because we require a lot of intellectual work, we're now seeing it kind of encroaching on our types of jobs. So definitely the requirement to keep up to speed with these changes are increasing, and I think spreading out into wider and wider parts of the workforce. So I definitely think the longer you are, let's say, or the more distant you are from the labour market, so that in terms of time, but also skills and experience, the harder it's going to be to come back in, or particularly to come back into jobs that you think are giving you the right sort of rewards, whether that's economic or social or respect. So trying to have choice in the types of jobs you're coming back to. So I think there is there is work that's being done. I know there's some really fantastic organizations out there, and I know that it's something that people are aware of. But I think there needs to be a piece really, which is about how we support people back into good jobs in later life, even if they have left during COVID. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be sort of encouraged to kind of get back in and sort of fulfill their purpose and fulfill the sort of things that they want to get from work, and then at the same time be able to give back to the economy as well, which I think a lot of people sort of do want to do, and be seen as productive, older adults and members of the community.
Mm. And what do you think about? And I'm not trying to get you to be particularly political here, but economically, fiscal policy has a big impact. We've seen that, for argument's sake, with pension changes and NHS doctors. They were in, I'll say, a crazy position where actually it wasn't worth them working because they were getting so penalised on their pension contributions that it was just nuts. There's been some changes around that, but is there enough foresight or forethought around kind of legislative changes that then suddenly significantly change your workforce? And if you're a large employer, and something like that comes along, all of a sudden, you are seriously challenged on those senior employees that you were reliant upon.
Yeah, the NHS, I think, is a really interesting example. We did some work with the Centre for Ageing Better, helping to evaluate some extended working life pre-retirement courses that they were supporting back in, I think, 2017, 2018. And one of them was with an NHS trust. And this was one of the issues that many people said, actually, we want to continue working. We're really passionate about our jobs. But actually, if I continue working after the pension age, I'm effectively sort of being economically penalised for doing that. So you had a very peculiar situation where people were leaving, didn't want to retire, and then were coming back on as kind of agency staff to continue working, and to the best of my knowledge, actually costing more to do that. So I think we've been very slow, and not just the UK. I think lots of governments have been very slow to kind of really anticipate what the changes in the sort of demographics have meant for policies around pensions, workforce planning, and all the rest. And I think some of these anomalies really illustrate that. But I think there's still there's sort of tip of the iceberg for lots of other sort of unconscious sort of lack of thinking about this. And I think again, this like a bit sort of ostrich-like, a bit head in the sand. I think people not really wanting to address it, people not knowing how to address it, I think is another challenge. So I ran a survey of employers or organisations in Wales, along with Business in the Community Cymru, just to sort of find out how organisations in Wales were preparing for or had prepared for their kind of ageing workforce. And I think it was something like quite astonishing. 5% of the respondents said that they had a sort of plan in place for their aging workforce. And yet most of them recognized that they were losing human capital. They were losing kind of skilled workers as people retiring, and, people weren't necessarily coming in to those industries, and they were fighting for a smaller pool of potential employees amongst younger adults. But just the lack of, I don't know, joined up thinking, a lack of foresight, a lack of maybe knowing where the gerontologists are to come and talk to. And I think, we do sort of see that at government levels as well. And I appreciate that it's a challenge. I mean, one of the sort of adages is, that governments often operate on 4 or 5 years electoral cycles, and, demographic change is much more glacial than that. But at the same time, we've seen it coming for the last 50 years. We could have really sort of thought about getting things in place sooner. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in order to create more kind of joined up thinking between government departments, who often don't talk to each other, from my experience around, aging. So there's not a kind of in the UK at least, there's not a department for older adults. So the Department for Work and Pensions will look after some aspects, Department of Health will look after other aspects, Department of Housing will look after other aspects. So where older adults sit across those departments is often challenging in terms of the joined upness. And then in terms of work, thinking about how they then connect to kind of employers organisations and trade unions, and then also how that information gets filtered down to older adults themselves through line managers, for example, or other organisations, about what their options are. So there's still a lot of work to be done, I think, just in terms of better evidence for policymakers and better information for kind of older adults themselves.
Yeah. And so who, out of the kind of organisations or the countries maybe that you're familiar with, who do you think is getting it right? And what are the key things of the countries maybe who are getting it right?
So I think everyone's getting it right and wrong in different areas. So there's no absolute leader of the pack. And sometimes when people leading the pack, it's often for other reasons. Just, in general, their economies are doing quite well. So the Scandinavian countries, I mean, they always stand out as doing quite well, but, they have a whole package of kind of, welfare that tends to support people throughout the life course. And I think that's one of the other key things, is that even though speaking as a gerontologist, we're interested in, if you like, the second half of life. You don't just miraculously one day appear as an older adult. You've lived a life up to that. And actually, I know it sounds silly to say it, but we need to kind of look at the whole life course. So, what are the things that people acquire? How do people get good things? What are the things that take away from arriving in your 50s and 60s and all the way to your 90s? So you've got all the good things that you need in order to have a kind of a good, healthy, happy life. So taking that life course approach is really interesting, but that's even more of a challenge to then think about joining up with, education, family care, unemployment benefits, to kind of think about how a person navigates through that sort of life course. But the Scandinavian countries tend to have more integrated policies, and in terms of work, they have what's called more active labour market policies. So once you're out of work, there are more things available to you to help you get back into work. So some of the training that you've mentioned as well, and benefits tend to be higher, which allow you to sort of still be able to kind of participate and kind of be healthy and not suffer from the problems that poverty can often provide. So there's that model, but in some respects, because they do quite well in general, there's not necessarily kind of a huge focus on a kind of a policy agenda around aging, because things are sort of okay. I was lucky enough last month to be in New Zealand, working with some colleagues on the North Island. I gave a talk in Wellington for the 18th anniversary of their long-running survey of older adults in New Zealand. And off the back of that, I was invited to meet with and chat to representatives of their what's called Office for Seniors. So they do have a cross-cutting department or forum that brings in people from across different departments in New Zealand government to take a more joined up holistic approach to kind of older adults. So I think that's a really good example. And kind of if we could see some of that in the UK would be really good. What we are seeing, and we sort of have in Wales, which is quite nice, are more older people's champions within government. So it's someone to kind of just knock on doors and have a bit of an overview of what's going on. This is at local government in particular, that impacts on older adults. And some of that's tied up with the age-friendly communities initiatives, which again, I think are quite nice in terms of providing an umbrella that sort of says, well, we've got all these, if you see the model, it's the different petals around the kind of core idea. You know, how does transport and health and housing, how do they all interconnect to provide a good space for older adults? So they are there, and in that sense, the UK is doing very well, and cities like Manchester in particular are kind of recognised as being kind of world leaders in the age-friendly communities space. But I would say that they are still, you know, relatively few and far between if we think about, you know, the sort of the extent of population aging and the, you know, how that is connecting with wider societal challenges, and you know, maybe needing a bit more joined up thinking across the piece.
Right. And you mentioned Manchester there. What are they getting right?
At the risk of embarrassing him, in one word really, or two words, Paul McGarry. So they've had a real champion for this in the local government for a very long time. I mean, they've also done really well to create a kind of a really good ecosystem there, bringing in the government departments, you know, the local government departments, working very well with colleagues at the university there. So people like Professor Tina Buffel and Chris Phillipson. So a lot of evidence going into how to sort of develop policies. So, I mean, they are doing the joined upness. So they're doing, you know, they're showing that it can be done. But I do know that it's taken a tremendous amount of energy to do that. And I think that unfortunately at the beginning, you know, it was very much reliant on a single individual. So there needs to be a bit more of a systematic approach, I think, to try and do that and really sort of embed that at a kind of cross-departmental level.
And have you got any examples, you know, of things that actually come from these people working together? You know, what are the outcomes for the older generation?
I mean, some of it's just as simple as making sure that bus routes that older adults rely on, particularly from certain parts of the city, don't fall into disrepair or actually have been reinstated. So ensuring people's mobility in later life. I know, and I don't know the extent to which it's been achieved, but taking more control over traffic planning. So in order to make sure that there are, you know, ways to get around the city, but also for pedestrians as well. So I know there was discussions about lengthening the amount of time you get to cross the road. So, you know, again, one of the observations that come out of the age-friendly communities work is that a lot of the ways in which our cities are designed are built around an idealized model of a sort of middle-aged man who's in good health, right? So how, dare say it, how you and I get around the city, it's designed for us. You know, and it's not necessarily well designed for other people who might kind of walk more slowly or have other kind of challenges in terms of audio, visual, you know, health, strength, and all the rest. So, some ways in which, you know, there are simple things to be done. So I've seen in, I think it's Japan or South Korea, crossing, so like you know, not pelican crossings, zebra crossings, where you can have a little badge that you can tap to ask it to kind of go for longer. So, you know, in order to be able to just have that extra couple of seconds to cross the road. So I was in Melbourne, just on the way back from New Zealand for a conference, and I would say, and I loved Melbourne, but I would say that it probably wasn't the most age-friendly city I've been to in terms of crossing the road. Almost as soon as the little green man came on, it was replaced very quickly by a little red man. And, even I found myself kind of walking pretty quickly to get across the road. And that's when they were really big, wide roads. For anyone that, is walking half a pace slower than me is, in real danger of getting either tooted in the horn or some kind of aggressive, car driving. So it's often simple things like that that can have a huge difference and make people feel like the areas in which they live are built for everybody, not just kind of a certain group of people.
Yeah. And, listening to you there, just, the simple things of getting around. And, we're in Christchurch in Dorset. We have an aging population. And my next door neighbour, who's 96, Peggy, has moved into a smaller flat. But they've changed the bus route, and all of a sudden she can get to where she wanted to get to, but it's now 2 buses.
Yeah.
And therefore it's to only get 3 miles up the road, it's now going to take an hour and whatever, And I just thought to myself, yeah, what a big impact that actually has. Alternatively, of course, I also see the buses with hardly anyone on.
Yeah.
So, I can see the problem, that you've got to be able to do things for a cost-effective measure. The thing that really interests me is, I like tech. I like computers and all that type of stuff. And in my family, I'm probably known to be the person to come to around a tech issue. But I also I also realize that I seem to be slowing on that.
Okay.
I notice that I'm not. It takes a little bit longer to get onto the. I'm all over AI and all that type of thing. But I just don't think I'm adapting to stuff quite as quickly as I was in my 20s. And then I think, I knock myself. So I'm 53. I think, put myself forward another 20 years. And again, the world will have moved on dramatically. The tech issue in my world of finance, online banking is a significant shift. How we consume our TV, our media now, this is a real challenge. What's your observations around tech in the older generation?
So the first thing I'd probably observe is I wonder whether that's an age thing or just an everybody thing. I think tech is moving so quickly. If we think about the AI revolution or whatever it is we're living through at the moment, almost everyone that I speak to, even people that consider themselves to be all over it, still are, as far as I can understand, are just scratching the surface. So I think there's been such an acceleration in technological change that even those groups that we consider to be the most technologically kind of on it, I think even they're finding it really challenging to kind of keep up with this current pace of technological innovation. I think in terms of age assumptions around technological competence, one of the only good things, or probably the only good thing that came out of the COVID pandemic was kind of busting some of those myths. So older adults showed themselves to be equally capable once given the time and the support to do so. They were on Zoom, they were sort of, as engaged with technology as younger adults because they had to and they wanted to do that. That said, I think there's a lot of things that we can do to improve technology to make it more age friendly. I remember when I was the deputy editor at a journal called Aging Society, sort of being in charge of a really interesting paper about the character size. This was a paper on phones for older Chinese adults. So just if you increase the character size by half a font size, that massively improved people's ability to sort of engage with the technology. So simple things like that, I think, again, can be done to make things more inclusive. The problem I would say is that often technology companies don't think about older adults. They have a kind of an idea of who their target audience is, and it's sort of younger people. So we don't really necessarily have voices for older adults in those tech companies. And I remember seeing a graph about the average age of employers in the main sort of IT tech space, and it was in their sort of late 20s, early 30s at most. So if we're thinking about where those ideas are coming from, it's just that issues around older adults aren't on the table. And there's been a sort of alongside that, we've also seen, not necessarily to do with kind of tech workers, but a decrease in cross-generational friendships. So people tend not to hang around with people of a different age group, and that seems to have gotten, more extreme over the last 10, 20 years. We are, to some extent, becoming more age segregated in certain ways: political views, culture, ideas, friendship networks. So people often don't even know an older adult who they can say, oh, this might be something that, Bob or Sue or John or Mira, might have an issue with. So I think there's some things there about representation. And again, and I'm not a tech expert, but people that I have talked to have raised some concerns about the extent to which, because things like AI and new forms of technology learn from computer users, so they harvest all that information from what's out there on the cloud and being kind of processed, and younger people tend to do that, whether there is a danger that AI itself might not necessarily be like age blind, but actually might kind of reproduce some of those either invisibility, so it won't represent the ideas of older adults because they're not feeding into the machine, or could even pick up on some kind of ageist assumptions in terms of language use. So I was looking for another project that I'm trying to sort of get off the ground at sentiment analysis, so the ways in which people can analyze language to see whether words are kind of positive or negative. And it was interesting in a number of the lists that I look at in terms of how you code words, that old was seen as a negative word. So even in the ways that, I understand why that's the case, because old is often considered negative in the way normal people speak. It has that sort of connotation still, unfortunately. But if that's getting replicated in AI, then there is a danger that there might be what someone has referred to as algorithmic ageism, to the extent to which these new systems kind of exacerbate already existing negative stereotypes around older adults.
Yeah. And listening to you there, of course, I'm also thinking actually with AI, the development of some stuff that actually will be really quite useful. You'll be able to possibly just talk to the washing machine and say, put it on for a 40-degree wash, please. Turn the heating on, turn it down. How much have I? Remind me to to order the milk and stuff like that. That may be a benefit to people as they get older. So there's two sides of every coin, as always.
Yeah, and I know I've got some colleagues at Swansea that have been looking at some of that sort of voice technology, your sort of voice assistants, as a way to maybe even combat loneliness in later life. You've got that kind of voice in your house, and it's a way to kind of communicate with people. So I don't think technology is either, inherently good or inherently bad. It's how it's kind of developed. And I suppose the challenge is really making sure it's developed for everybody, and that includes older adults. So making sure that, I suppose the thing is, well, making sure that we develop technology that we ourselves will be able to use as we age. So not also kind of, designing against our future selves. So, we're all, like I said, hopefully, we're all going to get to later life. So we all should have a vested interest in making the sort of best place we can get to. And part of that is making sure that we design technology, as you said, that supports us to age well, rather than technology that might sort of make it more difficult.
Yeah. Well, at least the demographic boom of the aging population, of course, is going to make it a market to be well served by companies of the world, on the basis that they're going to be big consumers of everything in the future.
Yeah, I mean, we had a project at Swansea University called the Arwin Institute. I mean, it's still there, but it's sort of going through a bit of a reboot, partly because we unfortunately got launched during COVID, where we weren't really able to bring older adults in to work with us. But the purpose was to kind of bring older adults and designers and businesses together to do this co-production stuff for products for aging population. Because one of the things that we did identify is that lots of companies don't think about older adults as consumers. I think they still kind of operate with the idea that later life is a time of poverty, so less income, is a time of less adventure, so people don't want to try new things. So there's still kind of an old idea that what you need to do is grab your consumer when they're in their early 20s, and then they stay brand loyal until they die, rather than people sort of, change as they go around and they want to try new things. And of course, they're going to go on that cool holiday or buy that new car or whatever it is they want to do. So there's a challenge there, I think, to sort of get companies to see older adults as active consumers. And I worked with, very lucky to work with a really good group back in, I think, 2006. I was working on a project around on a program called Cultures of Consumption, and we published a book called From Passive to Active Consumers, where we did show that older adults were spending more on leisure, whereas in the past most of their disposable income had gone on necessities. They were more and more engaged in the leisure economy. But I still say, if you think about most of the adverts you see for most products, it's still around that sort of 20 to 30-year-old demographic. Older adults are still relatively absent from those kind of general commercials. And often, even when you get adverts designed at what you might call an older market. So, working from home, we've all had the joys of watching daytime TV. So you see adverts for the sort of the walk-in baths and the kind of assistive technologies. And it's always, someone in their 40s sort of doing it. So even products that are aimed at them don't even sort of include them. So I think businesses are still behind the curve on this, to be honest. And again, it's kind of frustrating because, as you say, this is the biggest consumer demographic in terms of, disposable income, in terms of, exciting wanting to do things. And there's still a kind of a bit of a cultural lag in thinking about who to target for advertisements and marketing.
Interesting. So what's next for Martin Hyde?
Well, so I'm currently working on a project with Stephen Burke at United for All Ages and Dr. Lizzie Evans at Swansea University, looking at the impact of living in more or less age-diverse neighbourhoods. So, to go back to that issue around generational segregation or age segregation and the impact that's having. So we're starting to get some early results on that, which are quite interesting at the moment. And I think there'll be lots of interest in that, because people are, I think, concerned about this issue of residential age segregation. Are we more likely to live in groups of people our own age, or do we live in a kind of a mix of an area where there's a mix of people from different generations? And is that good for us or bad for us? And what's quite nice is that there's not that much evidence out at the moment, so kind of hoping to do that. And later in the year, I'm going to be moving to the University of Leicester to work with colleagues there on issues around older workers and age diversity in the workforce, which I think is probably where the next sort of phase of research on work is kind of going, really, which is we've done a lot of work looking at, not we as in me, but we as in the research community have done a lot of work looking at older adults and older workers and identifying some of the challenges and opportunities. But I think moving more broadly, we need to look at the age mix in the workplace. So it's not just about older workers versus younger workers, just like the work we're doing around neighbourhoods, but what's the mix within a workplace, and what do different age groups or generations or cohorts, however you want to call them, what do they bring in terms of different skills and experience and abilities and resources? And one would think that a company that had that mix, or a workplace that had that mix, was going to be better, because you had that whole range of things that you need to be successful, rather than, loading it all on one particular age group. But that's, I think, really where we can sort of begin to generate some really interesting insights into how we sort of, realize the opportunities of sort of demographic change.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of my podcast guests the other day was talking about a gentleman called Rory Sutherland, who's from Ogilvy, a kind of behavioural psychologist, and he talks about the Finnish railway, that in essence they pay them to come back. So they retire, and then they pay them to come back for a few hours a week to be available, or to be on call, because they don't want that 35 years of experience just walking out the door on one day. It's too valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there are examples of really good employers who do that, and you have sort of flexi time, and to sort of create situations that show older workers are valued without necessarily, working them, until they're exhausted and simply can't sort of give any more, and finding that balance. And again, I think I would argue or hypothesize that organizations that are flexible and diverse are able to withstand crises, because instead of breaking, they're much more able to absorb those crises and bounce back. So I think it'd be interesting to see if there's any work that looks at that in terms of the impact of the pandemic and cost of living crisis. Our more age diverse workforce is more likely to snap back post COVID. I think that'd be a really interesting piece of work to do, and to look at that. So age resilience in the workplace. I think rather than seeing age and older adults in particular as a kind of a drain and it's kind of, like you said, unproductive or less productive, less likely to learn. So again, when we did the survey of employers in Wales, and it's not Wales, we've seen the same figures in England and in America and Australia. Employers are actually quite positive in general about older adults, but the sort of skills that they value in them are those sort of soft skills, emotional intelligence, consumer friendliness, loyalty, punctuality. But they see them as less likely to be able to learn new stuff, less likely to be creative, less likely to be dynamic, and success oriented. So there's still that kind of slight, I would say, sort of bit of what Merv Eastman calls compassionate ageism in terms of thinking, older adults are really lovely and nice because they're warm and cozy, but also the kind of hard ageism that older workers are less able to sort of contribute, particularly as we go into these more technologically advanced forms of working. So I think we need, if we can focus on age diversity and age resilience, then we can look at how all age groups contribute to a productive workplace, rather than maybe pitting age groups against each other, or kind of saying, well, this age group does that and that age group does that, and not really kind of seeing how the mix operates across the whole piece.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, Martin, I really appreciate your time this afternoon. It's been fascinating talking to you. I wish you all the best with your new role and the continuing research and knowledge that you bring to this to this part of the aging workplace. So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. Been an absolute joy to talk to you.
Thanks once again to Martin for joining me today. I'm sure you will agree this is an extremely interesting subject and one that impacts us all. As ever, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps more people like you find us. And for more interviews and retirement planning videos, you might want to check out my YouTube channel. Just search for Justin_King or click the link in the show notes. If you want to get in touch with feedback or guest ideas, you can reach me on hello@theretirementcafe.co.uk. So until next time, I'm Justin King, helping you feel more informed in your retirement.